All right, welcome to today's webinar, The Importance of Cycling Signage and How to Do It Well, Leveraging TransLink's Cycling Wayfinding Guidelines with Adrian Bell, Director of Planning at the Applied Information Group. This webinar is brought to you by TransLink and Hub Cycling. A special thanks to the Applied Information Group for supporting this webinar. TransLink is Metro Vancouver's regional transportation authority, responsible for planning and delivering public transit and also playing a role with supporting our region's major roads and bridges, as well as walking and cycling. Hub Cycling is a not-for-profit charitable organization whose mission is to get more people cycling more often. And we accomplish this through advocacy, education, events, research, and consulting. You can find out more at bikehub.ca. On behalf of Hub Cycling, TransLink, and Applied Information Group, I'd like to acknowledge, respect, and celebrate the Indigenous nations on whose treaty and unceded territories we're fortunate to live, work, and operate. In working towards a better transportation system in our region, we have a role to play in supporting reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. My name is Erin Omlin. I'm the Executive Director for Hub Cycling, and I'll be moderating the session today. Just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. As you listen to the presentation, please use the chat function to ask questions. We will give Adrian time at the end to answer questions. As a reminder, the meeting will be recorded. Please do not record the meeting and do not share sensitive or personal information in the chat. I'm very pleased to be here today, engaging in the importance of an often underestimated tool to get people cycling more often. I know that I've often found myself confused when trying to navigate bike routes in the region. And when I see a cycling sign, I gain confidence, comfort, and encouragement that this is the route that's appropriate for cycling, and then I'm more likely to ride there again. Wayfinding is a cost-effective and straight-up effective way to increase cycling mode share, which is more relevant now than ever as we face climate and affordability crises. Cycling helps us respond positively to these challenges and more equitably and joyfully connects our region and communities. TransLink recognizes the importance and impact of wayfinding and provides BIC's cost sharing for its planning and implementation. They've got ready-to-use cycling wayfinding guidelines and templates to make the process simpler, more affordable, and importantly, more consistent for local municipalities and contractors. Before I go any further, I want to recognize that we've got a special guest joining us for the webinar. Kevin Quinn, the CEO of TransLink, is here, and I know Kevin wanted to take a few minutes to say hello.
Thank you so much, Erin. I don't want to take too much time here. I'm just really pleased to see and excited to see this event come together. At the start of the summer, Erin had very graciously invited me to go on a ride. We rode around the Tri-Cities area, and one of the things that we talked about were, what are the most important things that we can do to make cycling easier and really advance cycling in the region. And one thing that was very clear is that we need to make some improvements to wayfinding to make it easier for people to bike, to make sure people can comfortably and really confidently navigate their communities by bike. And so the good news is there's already been a lot of really good work that's been done by TransLink, by municipalities, by Hub to document best practices and identify a really common regional approach when it comes to wayfinding for cycling. And that was really captured in a report published by TransLink in 2013 called Get There by Bike, Wayfinding Guidelines for Utility Cycling in Metro Vancouver. And I think we all agree that now, more than ever, we have to prioritize active transportation, and reintroducing these wayfinding guidelines is a really important step to really ensuring that we can continue to deliver a safe and convenient experience for cyclists. And so through our regional cycling programs, we're already on board. We're keen to implement some of this improved wayfinding for cycling with our partners. So with that, I'm so excited to get going. Erin, thanks so much for having me. Thanks everybody for being here today. And without further ado, let's jump into it. Erin, back to you.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to have you here and listening. We're so privileged to have wayfinding and planning expert Adrian Bell with us today. Adrian was a part of developing TransLink's guidelines. Adrian Bell is a chartered transportation planner with over 30 years experience in the public and private sectors. Adrian developed his expertise in active transportation, behavior change, and urban mobility in the UK before he moved to Canada in 2008. During his career, Adrian has been Transportation Strategy Manager for a London Borough, Active Transportation Development Lead at Transport for London, and Mobility Management Lead for TransLink. Adrian is currently a Planning Director for Applied Information Group, where he's responsible for major wayfinding projects and business development when he's not bike touring, hiking, or sailing. Over to you, Adrian.
Thank you, Erin. Can everyone hear me okay? Hopefully. Yes, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Kevin, for being here to introduce the seminar generally. So as was mentioned, back in now 2013, the company I now work for teamed with another consultant, Alta Planning and Design, to prepare a set of guidelines for wayfinding to support utility cycling in the region. I'm here really to tell you a little bit more about what those guidelines are and to encourage the adoption of them by those authorities who have jurisdiction over active transportation, and to let you know that that's a free resource that anyone can use to improve wayfinding for cycling, particularly in the region. So let's get to basics. Well, what is wayfinding? Well, it's how we navigate. And essentially, wayfinding consists of three elements: knowing where we are, understanding where we go next, and importantly, but perhaps less obviously, learning about the place for next time. Now, with experience, most of us, when we travel, we don't think about wayfinding, it's subconscious. But when we visit a new place or try a new way to travel, wayfinding can be a very important and even a stressful activity. And anyone who's been to a hospital or an airport can probably attest to that. If we don't have the information we need to find our way, we might get lost, miss out on opportunities, or just have a bad day generally. Wayfinding design is the practice of creating information and other things that fill the gaps that we need to navigate and get the most from places and transportation. Typical tools for wayfinding, I suppose we'd automatically think about signs and perhaps maps, but there are other tools as well. And obviously, more recently, a lot of development in digital wayfinding tools, turn by turn and sat-nav tools, but also in the environment, whether it's environmental graphics applied to things or the way that urban design is used to make places clearer to use and easier to find your way around. So wayfinding is all around us all the time, and some of it is what you might think of as maps and signs. So what is a wayfinding consultant? Well, that's my job now, but it's a combination of a number of interesting disciplines. There is design, whether graphic or industrial design to design elements, but there is digital design and the sort of areas that I do, which is planning. So understanding how to develop a system of information that can be consistent and is applicable and maintainable over a long period of time. And some of the projects that we have developed, you have probably used. The TransLink's wayfinding system for its transit system and the T, we helped to design those. If you've been to UBC, that's a system that we designed. But we also have designed systems for buildings, for museums, the New York Met Museum, and for resorts and all sorts of other places. So there's a lot of interest in using wayfinding to explain systems, but also in this case, to promote new ways of travel to people who perhaps don't do it already. Well, let's ask ourselves, why is wayfinding important for cycling? And perhaps the first major one is that it removes a knowledge barrier for people to ride a bike. It's impossible to say that any wayfinding project will directly lead to a shift in how people travel or an increase in cycling, for instance, but it's pretty obvious that an absence of information about how to replace driving by another means of transportation is a barrier. It will be something that is a limitation to somebody trying or perhaps having a good experience when they travel. And studies show that when implemented, a coherent and connected way at a city scale of wayfinding can transform people's perception and encourage them to visit new places and try new ways of traveling. TransLink's system of wayfinding standards for cycling, for transit, has been cited as Canadian best practice, and we've seen real impacts around the world. In London, for instance, a system of pedestrian wayfinding was seen to increase walking within the areas it was implemented by 5%, which is a really significant increase just from implementing better information for people. So if it's a barrier to movement and it's a barrier to understanding, those are things that information can help to resolve. It's also revealing the opportunity. Many of you might recognize this as a part of Lougheed Highway near Stirling Burnaby Lake. If you're a driver, there is potentially a hard shoulder there you can ride your bicycle on, but it's not very appealing. But just across the way there, out of sight, is the Central Valley Greenway, a completely separate, protected, pleasant route for people to walk and bike on. But as a driver, if you weren't aware of it and you had no inclination to go and find it, how would you know that that alternative exists to what appears to be the only option of riding on Lougheed Highway? So signs that and other information that reveal the network for cycling opportunities is a good way to advertise the potential and to encourage people to think about cycling as a way of getting around every day. And thirdly, the wayfinding project helps to connect a regional network. There is a plan for the major bike network across the region, and the regional cycling strategy includes this long-term vision. The wayfinding system will help to connect those major strategic sort of arterial routes together and make the region connected by bike. Whether or not you would choose to make very long journeys on a bicycle is up to you, but knowing that you could do that and knowing that the whole region has this alternative network to connect you to places is a way to really help people feel that cycling is an alternative and an absolutely a viable way of moving around other than driving for shorter journeys. So just to talk a little bit about the guidelines themselves, the project was commissioned about creating a regional standard for wayfinding as part of the regional cycling strategy. And as part of that study, we were asked to look at best practices around the world and in North America. And many examples around the world are not easily transferred to our way of working in Canada because there are limitations such as our standards for traffic signs and the costs of introducing a completely custom set of signs. However, some of the things we saw around the world were taken forward into the guidelines. And some of these are the value of connectivity, the value of showing destinations on signs rather than just the route, the value of information that is better suited to the needs of people riding a bicycle rather than motorists, the opportunity to encourage people through information rather than just give them the information plainly. So use information to encourage them to try and cycle. And the consistency, the reliability of information that is the same everywhere, so that if you travel out on your bike, you have the security of feeling that you won't ever be left without the information you need to get back or to complete your journey. The resulting guidelines is a downloadable document available on the TransLink website, and I think the link for that was in the invitation to this seminar. And it contains a number of parts. So it's not only a set of sign templates, a set of designs for this standard system of information across the region, but it's also a set of guidelines and advice for practitioners on how to step-by-step implement wayfinding so that it is consistent and can cross different municipal boundaries and different areas consistently and support the user along their whole journey. And that's is written in a way that is for practitioners, but should be understandable by anyone. It's a simple approach to this information. It's based on a set of principles that looks at trying to put the user's interests first. And it's very important with a wayfinding system that it responds to what people need to find their way and to make their journey successful, and not simply to what might be operationally more convenient. So the principles, and I won't go through them all here, but they end up with a system that perhaps moves away from the picture in the middle there, which is probably one everyone's seen, which is really a description of what the facility is, and a set of arrows that just shows you which way it runs, to something that provides you information about where you can get to, and perhaps what you might find along the way. A system that is much more useful and a much more informative system, and less just an operationally sort of functional system. But to obviously introduce something like the image on the right, you have to have some structure behind it. You have to have some rules and some criteria that everyone follows equally. The information family that we designed is very simple, and that was on purpose. We wanted to make sure that the signs themselves were very similar to standard traffic signs, so that any authority could implement them cheaply and quickly within their existing experience, but also contain some additional elements to it to make cycling an easier thing to do. So there are two key signs: a decision sign that is that marks the point of a turn just before you make a turn, and then a confirmation sign, so that after you've made the maneuver, you can then tell what is ahead of you, what the next few destinations are ahead of you. What we don't want to do is create too much information before you make the maneuver, so that you can then concentrate on making that maneuver safely. And there are a few other additional signs as part of this, special signs that provide finger post signs that give you directions at certain turns off of the network. There are signs that give you an indication of how to get to a signed route. And there are diagrammatic signs or map-based signs that explain complicated situations. For instance, if you're approaching a bridge ramp, or you're making a more complicated designed turn, then we explain that by drawing it for you rather than trying to explain it in text. The design standards, as I mentioned, they are intended to work alongside the existing traffic signs, which are part of the Transportation Association for Canada's regulations on these. But we made some minor adjustments just to make them work a little bit better for cyclists. So as I mentioned earlier, to respond to the ergonomics of cycling, how it is to ride a bike. One of those is that we changed the arrow symbol so that it is clearer to see at smaller sizes, because these signs are generally smaller than motorist signs. We also allowed for the inclusion of branded logos or named routes, which is important because many municipalities have promoted routes and they've got their own identity, so that can be included. And we've allowed for future growth of the system. So as part of the major bike network, it's possible that that network, for instance, might be numbered or coded in some way. So the standards allow for routes to have a route name, as many of them do now, but also perhaps to have a route code, which would then be an easy way to remember wayfinding information for longer journeys. So all of this detailed information is included within the guidelines to assist local planners and local designers to implement these systems consistently. Alongside the standards and the guidelines and the designs, we've also included some description of other things that can be done to help with wayfinding on cycling routes. Some of these relate to how cycling routes are designed. So the use of materials or lighting or landmarks and planting are ways that we can help people to find their route, find their way along a route without having to add the clutter of lots of signs. And while we don't go into detail in those, because they really are local decisions, we reinforce the value of these things alongside a consistent system of information for signs. As I mentioned earlier, the designs and the look of these signs and how they are placed in the environment is one thing, but a very important part of this is that the information and the destinations shown on these signs is rigorously consistent no matter where you are. So you don't want a system that when you cross over a municipal boundary changes from one side to the other. And so we introduced a set of guidelines, a 6-step process that helps the planner to break the system down, to identify the locations for signs, the right type of sign at the right place, and the right information to go on that sign, wherever it is in the network. And this is really important for cycling to become a more creditable and reliable system of transportation, as it is with using transit or driving your car. We want the information for cycling to be that consistent everywhere. And so the planning guidelines part of the document is a very important part to guide local authorities through that process of implementing these things consistently, and to coordinate with each other to make sure that their bike routes are have wayfinding that is consistent along the route. One of the important parts of that is a system for agreeing the name of places that are shown on these signs. So we have a hierarchy of destinations that are based on short local journeys. What we looked at was making sure that journeys on this, that really the maximum distance between destinations we wanted to show people was no more than about 8 kilometers. And that's about the average cycling journey in the region. And that remembers that the audience for the wayfinding is not people who cycle every day and know where they're going, but it's people who might try and cycle, who we want to go a little bit further, or to perhaps use their bike to commute rather than just going out with the kids on a weekend. Real utility journeys. So we made sure that we looked at connecting urban centres together, and then local neighbourhoods. And then other elements such as major attractions or local destinations are things that are more locally defined. So there are a few things, the top 2 of those, urban centres and local neighbourhoods, that are defined within the document, and they're the only definitions that you can use. Whereas major attractions and local destinations have a bit more opportunity for local decision making about what is included on the system. In that way, we make sure that it's regionally consistent, but still responding to local interests and local needs. Also within the document, what we felt was very useful to do was give some examples. So there are many complicated situations across the region where cycling routes have been built after other infrastructure, and therefore they are fitted in around things, and it can make for complicated areas to sign. And so we've given a number of examples of practical advice for typical situations, complicated situations, that show how the wayfinding standards can be applied to provide everyone the information they need. And we think that's a really helpful guide for planners and other practitioners to apply the standards in complicated situations. We also stress the real importance of coordination, and this, of course, is where TransLink can really help. It is critically important that the user is supported, as I've mentioned before, when they cross different areas and different jurisdictions. I mean, I'm not picking on anyone in particular, but this is just local to where I used to live, which always amused me that across Boundary Road, that the 2 routes that connected physically were named differently. So if you were planning that journey, you might be confused about where the journey goes. The idea of the guidelines is to help join up these gaps in the network and to provide a consistent way of providing information, because the wayfinding directs you to places rather than names of routes. An important point for all this, of course, and many of you may be thinking, so how much does all this cost? It sounds like a lot of new signs. And while, of course, we are talking about new signs, wayfinding is quite a cheap option when talking about installing new infrastructure for cycling. So from an example we've recently done with the city of Saskatoon, to install the sort of signs that we're talking about here, this sort of system approach where you have signs at all those important intersections, is around about $3,000 to $7,000 per kilometre of a typical sort of urban network. So not an insignificant cost, but very small in comparison to resurfacing or creating a new bike path. So it's very much affordable. And of course, it's, as Erin mentioned at the start, this is something that is eligible for BICS funding through TransLink as part of those regional projects. So it's something that you can, as a municipality, you can apply for funding for a significant proportion, I think 75% and sometimes even more of the cost of the wayfinding system to make that part of the network connect together. So it's relatively cheap. Of course, it's very quick to install because these are just signposts essentially. And then there is a route to have these projects funded. So in a way, this could be a very early win for a regional network. We'd like to think so. And I'd just like to really finish with perhaps where it goes next. I think when we were developing these guidelines back in 2013, signs were the main aspect of the guidelines. That was the intention. But obviously, we have come a long way in nearly 10 years. And there are a lot of other considerations that could be part of this system, whether it's at a municipal level to add to the system or perhaps in revisions of this in future. So we need to think about accessibility of the system, whether that is with integration to digital applications. There's lots of digital wayfinding applications out there. How well does this work with that? For people perhaps who are walking on these routes, non-visual access to information, but other things as well. Could we make the cycling network more engaging as part of the wayfinding experience to help you, encourage you to use it and to make it more easy to remember by placemaking, by designing things that are not just physical environments, but sensory environments. And perhaps most importantly, by the use of other maps and diagrams to help people to understand where the route goes through, perhaps what is around them, what are the opportunities for wayfinding for cycling to become more integrated in our experience of the region overall. So that's a very quick run through. I would encourage you to download the document from the TransLink website to read through it. And particularly if you're a municipality, then please go to TransLink or come to us at Applied. Ask us if you're interested in developing projects on the ground. Be very interested and excited to help you. And I hope that's been interesting for everyone. And I'm happy to take some questions or lead some discussion.
Thanks so much, Adrian. You really provided us with a lot of information and lessons for policymakers and advocates on this call. It's great that TransLink invested in this wayfinding tool so that municipalities don't have to each reinvent the wheel to develop their own wayfinding standards, and they can use these existing templates to save time and money and to provide that very important, consistent and useful product for people that are cycling across city boundaries. And again, TransLink does cost share on wayfinding even as a standalone project. I know the audience has raised a number of questions, so let's move over to those. Christopher asked, did you ever consider using time instead of distance on the signs?
Yes, it was something that we suggested early on, because when we do pedestrian systems, we always recommend using time. However, the variability of speeds between different cyclists made that a more challenging proposition to understand. And so it was felt in the end that distance was a more reliable metric for cyclists to use. But it's a good question, one we had considered.
Great. Gavin asked, there are inherent challenges in building a wayfinding system that meets the ergonomic needs of people cycling, but which can advertise the network to drivers. What recommendations do you have for agencies looking to reach both of these audiences?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there is a thought, well, if I perhaps use the example from the project we did with Saskatoon just recently, part of that system where they're building out their system right now from virtually nothing is to include landmarking as part of the system. So there are just elements of the wayfinding system that really is just a marker, a very large visible marker, just to say, hey, this is a cycling facility. So there's value in perhaps public art or other things that landmark the system to show it, advertise it to people without it necessarily being a forest of signs. And the other thing about ergonomics, I think it would be really nice, although it's not really permissible within our current regulations, is to have signs that are lower down, because I think, as all of us who probably are cyclists on the call know, you don't spend a lot of time looking 8 foot in the air. You tend to look at where your wheel's going to go and 20 feet in front. So use of road markings is a really good way of doing that, but also lower signs. If there's a way to do that locally in a way that's safe for people, I think that's something that's well worth investigating.
Great, thank you. Adrian, are you able to turn on your video?
I can indeed.
There you are.
I'm actually in MTC's offices in the Bay Area talking about wayfinding for their transit system. So.
You're everywhere. You're the
wayfinding
expert. We have some more questions here for you. I'm going to combine these two between Amrita and Graham. Amrita was asking, would local sign shops source these signs based on the standardized dimensions? And Graham asks, what program do you use to design the signs and the signage plans?
Sure. Yeah, our intention was entirely that as much as possible, these signs could be made at local sign shops or existing local traffic sign suppliers. They're all standard sizes. And they're 150 millimeter increments of size. So they're all standard plate signs, and that was important that they are easily developed. I think the only one that's slightly unusual is the finger sign, which is the pointed end sign, but that is also an easy fabrication. We use a variety of systems to design, software to design these signs. I think these were designed using Adobe Creative, but we have a lot of systems we use depending on what is needed, but this was a fairly straightforward project.
Great. Chris asks, is there any guideline for indicating to people cycling which routes are protected from traffic and which routes have no separation from traffic?
What we did do, yeah, that's a really good point. What we did do was include the opportunity for subtext lines within directions. So some of them might say via scenic route, for instance, or via quiet route. We wanted to make sure that there was space within the sign design to allow for that via, and that sort of qualifier, because I think we recognize that, particularly when we're talking about new or unfamiliar cyclists, we wanted to give them the option to take a route that might be more comfortable for them. But we didn't want to over define that, because I think that comes down to the local community to decide what they have available and what they consider to be a safe and convenient and comfortable route. Not everybody can provide AAA routes right now, I suppose, but it might well be able to provide an unmade scenic route that's suitable for some, but not for others.
Okay, thank you. Josh said, as a suggestion, in a city with the topography of Metro Vancouver, elevation differences can be a major impediment to cycling. So perhaps including elevation gain to a destination could be a good idea. Was this considered?
Yes, it was. I mean, we did for a while toy with the idea of having a sort of ski route sort of classification of black, blue, and yellow, green routes. It was considered a little bit A, subjective, and B, potentially off-putting. The difficulty, we have also looked into the using gradients and other things like that, but unfortunately not enough people really understand. We just felt it was a bit of a barrier to people. Would you necessarily understand a gradient or an elevation rise? It's been used in some places, particularly in the States. There are areas that have used elevation gain, but I think we felt in conversation with TransLink that it might have been more complicated to explain than the value of explaining it. So there are other facilities, of course, maps and third-party providers that can provide that more detailed trip planning information. So we wanted to keep the signs as simple and as easy to use as possible so that people could use them.
Okay, I think you froze there right at the end there, but.
Oh, sorry.
What was the last sentence?
Oh, I think, yeah, we wanted to keep the signs as simple as possible so people didn't have to stop to read them. And also we have to comply with the transportation regulations about the complexity of signs as well. So we had to work within some constraints, but it is a valid point for sure.
Great. Tyron asks if you have experience in the Greater Toronto area and if there's a similar unified system there.
We do have experience in the Greater Toronto area, but only on the transit system. So there is a system that the City of Toronto instigated called TO360, which is a pedestrian system, but that does have a cycling component. One of the similar companies to us, Steer, have developed that, but I don't know quite whether that is in the ground yet, but I know it was certainly proposed.
Great. Krista asking a follow-up questions on the artwork. She said small municipalities find it challenging. The artwork is more challenging to manage. Are there templates that can be provided for sign suppliers to use and create proofs or print files from?
Yes, and thank you. That was almost a planted question, because I forgot to mention that as part of the guidelines, there are a set of templates that can be used in Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator. So you can just use those templates and put your own information in and send them to a sign shop to manufacture. So thank you for that question.
Great. Joseph asks, route closures can lead to confusion or discomfort while cycling, particularly in unfamiliar areas where an individual may not immediately know an alternate route. Were considerations for detours included in the standards?
Yeah, I think what we wanted to do was say that the guidelines that are part of the standards can be used in any application. So there are guidelines for helping people to find their way by bicycle, and then we've included a set of standard signs for use on existing routes. What we were aware of is that, of course, that the quality of routes and the conditions on those routes varies tremendously across the region, and not all routes currently join up as a consistent standard or quality or condition. So we had to give our best guidance really to say, well, it needs to be a local sort of engineering judgment to say when wayfinding is put in, because you are promoting that route for cyclists. But the guidelines can be used to indicate a route along a quiet residential street with no facilities, because it's simply a suitable place to ride your bicycle without any additional infrastructure. And the guidelines could be used for a diversion on a route during construction as well. The guidelines themselves, the planning guidelines, work in any situation, and the sign templates can be adapted to a temporary application as well. So we try to make it as general as possible with good principles and good practices, rather than just limit it to this can only be done when the route is finished and fully complete.
Thank you. And I'll just add that Hub Cycling does have some policy recommendations about cycling detours. They're not the detailed design of the wayfinding around it, but talking about how to structure those policies and bylaws in your municipality. So we'll try and link that as well in the chat and the follow-up notes too. Josh asks, are there any thoughts you have on how to incorporate amenities into the destination, such as washroom, water fountain, grocery store, SkyTrain, or dining?
Yeah, I think it is very much on our mind that was something that people mentioned to us, particularly cycling groups, when we were designing this. And the reality is you have to balance up the clutter and the amount of signage to indicate, you know, a bike shop or a washroom, compared to the information that most people want to use, and the other sources of information for that type of detail. So yeah, we left it open that the destinations include criteria right down to the fourth level, which I showed, which was sort of local attractions, and that can be anything really locally defined. But we were very clear that the trade-off is the more of those destinations you include, the more signs you will require, and you will need to update as those things change. So when you get down to that level of amenity, those things can change quite rapidly, and that can be quite a burden on maintaining a sign system. So realistically, the best way to treat those things is online digital applications, which can be updated, you know, more or less instantly and very cheaply, rather than a very large sign system. So that's where we landed on that.
Okay. John asks, to make off-street bikeways safer, He feels bollards installed on off-street bikeways don't enhance safety, even if they have wayfinding on them. He feels they're dangerous obstruction. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's not my field. I am a cyclist, however, so I tend to agree that I'd rather not have close together bollards, but that's kind of a personal view. So, I mean, Erin, you're probably better qualified to talk about that.
Hub Cycling also has a policy recommendation on bollards and how they're used. So we will also link that in the webinar notes. But generally, the fewer bollards, the better. And making sure it's intuitive where you are supposed to go. So there's not two, or an even number of bollards is confusing because there's 3 pathways and there's only 2 directions, for example. But we will share.
What I would say, sorry, Erin. What I was going to say, though, there is value in way marks. So a post with a simple mark on it just to indicate the route rather than putting up a whole sign. But that can be off to the side, not a bollard in the middle of the route, but a waymark, a post with an arrow on it effectively, maybe all you need. So I wouldn't discount the value of any sort of vertical post, but obviously it's where it's positioned is often the problem.
Yes. Yeah, we just want to avoid obstructions in the pathway where at all possible. What cities, in your opinion, have good, effective wayfinding for cycling?
That's a good question. I've not found many that I, as a cyclist, really feel work very well. As you can tell, I'm from the UK originally, and I was working for Transport for London when we started to install better wayfinding for cyclists there. But even that is a system that on the face of it looks good, but it's been very difficult to coordinate. I think the real challenge is that there isn't a set of standards at the federal level that really cater for cycling design. All of the regulations that we have to deal with for signs that go on the highway are derived from regulations that suit motorists. So signs have to be above head height, they have to be a certain size, text has to be a certain size. All of these things are not ideal for cycling, which is an activity where you are physically exposed, you're looking at the ground in front of you, you're more connected with the environment, you see things differently. And in my opinion, my sort of professional opinion, I suppose, is where you have that situation, there is no ideal example in North America, at least, of a good wayfinding system. Those in Northern Europe, as you might expect, Denmark, the Netherlands, tend to be better, but they tend to have a very different approach. So smaller signs, more connected, a very different approach, very different regulations for cycling signage away from traffic signage. Here, we have to work within essentially the regulations that are designed for motorists, and that makes it difficult.
Thank you. Chris asks, has any consideration been given to indicate on SkyTrains or bus that there are cycling routes located at certain stops?
Yes, there has. As part of the work we did with TransLink to develop the transit wayfinding system, there are effectively first and last mile walking from here, and in some cases cycling from here, posters, map posters that have been designed. So they are intended to give people leaving transit that information. And so that standard does exist, and it's I think it's still being rolled out, but that's part of that original idea for the transit wayfinding system.
Mark has a question. Are there strategies to future-proof wayfinding systems? Can they be living systems that reflect new destinations or advancements in technology without significant added cost?
You had to add that qualifier. Yeah, I mean, for sure, there is a lot of technology available. So in transit systems, for instance, digital screens, e-ink screens, links to your personal device are all possible. But there is a cost application. There is a cost implication for doing that. There is a redundancy implication for the speed that technology moves. It's more difficult for road signage. Obviously, we do have, and you will see what are described as variable message signs, so live information signs. But again, that's a significant cost. And there really is a role for, at this stage anyway, basically signing the existing cycling system and using the other, our opinion is using those other proprietary tools, whether it's the trip planning apps or the, the sort of global mapping apps to help you to tie it together. But the important thing is that what you plan at home is then supported in the real world. And that's where it often breaks down, because it might look great on a map sitting in your front room, but when you get out on the street, if you can't find your way to that path, you can get lost very quickly. So for sure, there is a role for technology. It's an assistance, but it's not necessarily the cheap and easy option yet anyway.
Technology may save us only sometimes. And Rita asked, have most or all municipal jurisdictions accepted these TransLink guidelines as part of their design or implementation guidelines?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I'd like to think so. I mean, certainly when we developed them, there was a lot of agreement to the value. And I think a lot of people were grateful to see that there was a standard. They are slowly rolling out. Every time I come back to Vancouver, I do see a few more, and there are examples. But yeah, I think it's been slow, and I would really encourage municipalities perhaps to revisit them and perhaps to talk to TransLink about the funding to get them in the ground.
And I will add that there have been other comments in the chat saying, from their perspective, unfortunately, few agencies in Metro Vancouver have fully embraced the guidance. And I will just say anecdotally, when I chat with municipal staffers that are considering wayfinding, I always talk about the TransLink cycling wayfinding guidelines. And at least half of the time, it's surprising to them that the guidelines exist. So that is one of the reasons why we're hosting this today. We want to spread the awareness far and wide that TransLink has done the hard work of creating the guidelines. Hopefully these templates and this guidance just makes it as easy as possible to get these in place. We've got some more questions. The guideline may cover this, but is the recommendation to only include high quality wayfinding on actual bike routes, or would they in an ideal world also exist on all streets, including dangerous arterials?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, what we have suggested in the guidelines is that the best way to approach this is to plan out your local network and its connections to the regional network, and then say these are the routes that should be signed. Now, the judgment on which routes should be signed are slightly driven by, say, the regional connectivity. So there will be regional networks, as we know, and slightly by how do we get our local communities to join to that regional network. It's not our intention with the guidelines that every possible street would be covered with signs. I don't think anyone wants that. So the question is, what is the right balance? And to our way of thinking in the guidelines, it was to connect the region, connect these communities and major centres together. Everything else is then a local option, depending on what your preference is, what your resources are. But the important thing was that for utility cycling, we wanted to make a reliable, connected system, a network possible through information that connects places together. So it might be that in that planning process, that looking at the network and saying what routes should be signed, it may well reveal some routes that are actually redundant as well, and didn't need to be signed at all. Now, they might be purely local routes or pleasure routes or whatever, but I think what we were focused on was not creating a sign system that perhaps is for tourists or for leisure cycling, but really as part of the transportation strategy, a system that makes cycling a viable transportation option. So I think in answer to that, it's not the intention that these signs will be used everywhere, although the guidelines allow them to be applied wherever you feel they should be.
Okay, an aligned question from Milan is, and this is a big one, can you solve poor infrastructure with signage?
No, I think it's a very important point that given the audience we want to connect with, which are the people who, as I mentioned, really are concerned but interested. I think that's the group. That people who perhaps have got a bike or use a bike but don't really use it for utilitarian purposes, don't commute or take trips to their friends or go shopping with a bicycle, that we want to support those people. Now, those people also need good infrastructure. They need protection. Their number one fear in almost all cases is going to be their personal safety and their fear of traffic. Signs don't protect you from that, but signage can help you find a route that suits your needs. And if the signage isn't there, then how would you know that there might be a great alternative, safe, protected route? So I think it's got a role, but it's not a replacement for good infrastructure or safe traffic management, for sure.
Yes, very important. I often run into people that are telling me, well, I'd never ride along that busy route. And then I ask them, did you know that one block over there is a quiet, very comfortable bike route? And much of the time they're totally unaware. So I agree. Wayfinding has a role in education and awareness building for sure. I have a question about when you're considering destinations, choosing destinations that you're going to be listing, what equity considerations do you take into account? And do you have any advice around related community engagement, including First Nations and other community engagement for route names, including signage or art?
Yeah, I think it's an important point. I mean, what we did, as I mentioned earlier, was we tried to set a few I mean, the major centres obviously are named and they're in without dispute, really. But when you get to local neighbourhoods, that I think is something that we took from municipal official community plans. So there has been consultation about developing neighbourhoods and established neighbourhoods there, but that is a constantly evolving picture of the region. And I think we always would say that, you know, wayfinding should reflect how we speak about directions. So if you ask somebody, how do I get to X destination? And they'll give you a series of directions. You really want your wayfinding system to reflect that language, how we speak about the place. So when it comes to the destinations that are not predefined in the guidelines, the major ones, then I think there is obviously room for community engagement in that process, which we mention in the guidance. And that could include naming routes. That's a valid part of a wayfinding system, a named route. It's easy to follow. And yeah, that should really follow what local or any extent of local engagement on any process of naming the place where you live. And I think we would encourage that because it just helps to give the wayfinding system, keep it in touch with place, keep it real for people, and make it relevant to the sort of journeys they're making. But we don't want to predefine what they are. We leave it to local municipalities at that level to do that work and to define what's important to their communities.
Great, thank you. Mark asks, should cities design and procure signage for future bike routes for day one implementation?
It's a good question and a tricky question from somebody I probably know. I think for us, what we suggested was that it's perfectly feasible to use wayfinding to mark a route. If it's safe, I think that would be the most important thing, to mark that route before it's improved, because you can then build up the usage to make the argument that it should be improved, for instance. However, you have to be careful about that because, as we've already discussed, we don't want to encourage people onto a facility that falls short of what they feel they need to support them, and therefore they're discouraged and never go cycling again. So it is certainly possible to use wayfinding on its own with suitable facilities. It's a different proposition to say we won't do any wayfinding until our entire municipal network is built out and finished, because that may never happen. So I think there has to be a point at which wayfinding is used when the judgment is there that there is enough of the network in a good condition that it would suit the type of riders that you're looking at using it. And that's not a very specific answer, but I don't think there is a right or wrong time when to implement wayfinding. I think it requires judgment. It can be used to promote a route, or it can be used to launch a route at the end. And I think our preference or our suggestion many times is it's a good opportunity when you are instigating a system to start to advertise it to people and get use going, because that helps to, beat back some of the arguments you hear that this new route hasn't got anybody using it.
Yeah, thank you for that nuanced answer.
Sorry if that's complicated. I'm sounding like a politician, but it's not always simple.
Oh, good. My last question before we wrap up here is, sometimes folks ask, what's the difference between wayfinding and branding, and what role does branding take in this? Is there anything that you haven't covered that you want to touch on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, brand is very important. That some of their routes, I think we use the example of the Spirit Trail, for instance, on the North Shore. That branded route is a very strong, visible presence on the North Shore, and it would be foolish for us not to reflect that brand in the signs, because that's what people will look for. And named routes, other promoted routes, equally have importance, but brand isn't everything. And if it's too complicated, and logos sometimes don't always work well on signs, then they can detract from the clarity of the information. So we're quite clear that the information we're giving people is how to get from place to place. The fact that that route has an identity, to the extent that that helps you to follow that route, that's useful. But brand, for instance, sort of sponsored signs or branding in other ways of the system, is something that has to be quite carefully considered. It can be too much information. It can lead the user away from what the purpose of the sign is. And so I think it's a very useful tool, but it isn't what drives how people find their way, if that helps.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, before we wrap up, I would like to extend a big thank you again to Adrian Bell and the Applied Information Group. Thank you also to Kevin Quinn for his remarks at the beginning of the presentation, and for TransLink's interest and commitment to this subject. We will be sending around a recording of this meeting in the next few days, as well as any resources Adrian, TransLink, and Hub want to share. We'll include the Hub recommended bollard policies, because certainly we want folks of any kind of age, ability, and bike type, like those with trailers and cargo bikes, to be able to get through on bike paths. We'll share our position on accommodating people cycling during construction. If you'd like more ways to get involved in Hub, or you enjoyed today's webinar, you can now join Hub as a lifetime member for a minimum contribution of $10. And the more members Hub has, the greater the impact when we advocate for better, safer biking. All of that and more at bikehub.ca. Don't forget to apply for BIC's cost sharing to improve your local wayfinding, and for the promotion and enabling that lets people know it's easier and more intuitive to ride in the community. There is TransLink BIC's funding available specifically for promotion and enabling. We are at the end of our webinar. Our facilitators will leave the meeting open for a few minutes longer for those of you that want to leave comments in the chat. Thank you again to our panelists. You may leave the meeting now if you wish. Participants, thank you for joining us, and you are welcome to log off.